On behalf of the staff of the IHE, I want to extend my gratitude to all of you for coming tonight. This should be an exciting conversation between two prominent authors, two prominent writers who are concerned about the direction of conservatism and its relationship with politics in the United States today. We at the IHE are extremely grateful that both of these people made themselves available at our invitation to join us. I was quite frankly shocked that they agreed so quickly to be the first, I believe, live appearance together, right, to discuss a conversation that many of you, I'm sure, have read. That's important. It's an important conversation. It's not just a kind of trivial thing. It's actually about the direction of our country and a direction about, the direction of conservatism in the United States. So we're glad that we'll be able to make a couple of small steps today. And I'm really, really grateful that all of you came here. You can see by the crowd that this has struck a nerve. There are a lot of people interested in this. I think we had over 600 RSVPs for this event, which is by far our largest event so far. We are also live streaming this, and there's a great deal of excitement for a live stream as well. I imagine our numbers there will be excellent too. So this, like I said, it's really struck a nerve, and it's time for the United States to have this kind of conversation and to bring people together around it. That's what we're committed to at the IHE. We're committed to this kind of conversation. We're committed to the pursuit of truth and the power of reason in that pursuit. Perhaps that tilts me towards one direction or the other in this conversation. I'll let you judge that on your own. I'm especially grateful, of course, to Sohrab. If you follow Sohrab on Twitter, you may learn that he just celebrated the birth of his child a day ago. If anyone ever had a reason, right, to say I can't make it, it's that, right? And here he is with us. So we're really indebted to him, of course. And your wife. Yes. So yeah, absolutely. Just a couple words about format. You guys might know Ross Douthat. He's an IHE fellow, in addition to writing for a newspaper that all of us don't subscribe to, but read nonetheless. A cheap shot, I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. Anyway, Ross is also an IHE fellow, and he's been with us now for a couple of years, and he helps put these events together, and we're also indebted to him for his generosity and his creativity in thinking about ideas like this. And he's also a fantastic moderator, as we'll see tonight. I will turn things over to Ross. He will moderate the conversation. After a while, I will get back up and start fielding questions. It's hard to sit there and be involved in responding and also be finding the right people to speak. So once they're done, I will come back up. I will start looking and pointing at people and asking people to speak. There will be 2 microphones that will be circulating the room. Just be patient. And of course, be considerate of others in the room. No speeches. Questions for the right people. We're all here to hear these people. So if you could just make a nice succinct question to them, they'd, I'm sure, be happy to give you a speech in return. And then afterwards we have, we'll have some refreshments, so just please stay later if you're able to. Enough from me at this point. Let's welcome our guests.
Woo! Come on. Normally, I would remain seated in a sort of inobtrusive moderator style, but this is a big deal. You know, this is the thrill. What was it? The
melee at CUA.
The melee at CUA. Thank you. Yes, that's copyrighted, by the way. Royalties to David Frenchism Limited. So, all right. No, I'll sit down. It is my great pleasure to be here with 2 gentlemen whom I've been reading profitably for many years, maybe more years in the case of David than Rob, 19, but, and already has 2 children. He's the most pronatalist, no. But if you're here tonight, or if you've stumbled on this via live stream, or if you're watching the YouTube highlights 20 weeks hence, this is an argument about the future of conservatism, and particularly social and religious conservatism, in an age of arguably increasing secular hostility to traditional religious faith, rising populism of various forms and varietals in Western Europe and the United States, and of course, in the age of Donald Trump. And my two discussants are both, I think, from the perspective of, let's say, the normative reader of the New York Times, radical religious conservatives. I think that's fair to say, from the, as am I suppose, from that perspective. But they have what appears to be a fairly profound disagreement about a great host of things related to the future trajectory of conservatism, Christianity, social conservatism, and so on in the US. And I think I'm just going to start by asking Sohrab the question that I know is on everyone's minds here tonight, which is Habsburg or Stuart? No, that's not, sorry. There's going to be a lot of monarchy jokes from me directed to Sohrab, and a lot of mild anti-Protestant banter directed towards David, so I just want to warn everyone in advance. Yeah, so, Sohrab, since you made this evening possible with a piece for First Things a few months ago, start by telling us what is David's Frenchism, and why are you against it?
It seems to work. Well, thanks to the IHE for having us, and for Ross for moderating, and David for joining as well. Since this is what I think will be the first meeting of the CUA Catholic Integralist Club, and all of you are members, including David, just for having walked through the door. I think we should begin with 3 Pater Nosters for the intention of the Holy Father. I'm kidding. No, I did bring, in all seriousness, I did bring David a gift, because I dragged him into a debate. And it was a necessary debate. I'm glad that I did, but I brought him some Kentucky bourbon, just in the sense to first of all, thank you for participating in the debate, and also to thank you for your service to the country, and for your work on behalf of religious liberty. And because we're going to talk as 2 patriots about the common good. We both care about the common good. And these days, you can't talk about the common good without some bourbon in you. So, anyway. What is David Frenchism? I would define David Frenchism as a program for negotiating Christian retreat from the public square into a safe private sphere that liberalism, a kind of totalizing, overweening, aggressive liberalism, would have us retreat into, a kind of readout of various sorts. And I'm not prepared to retreat into a private readout or a private sphere, and so I oppose David Frenchism.
That was shockingly pithy.
But I mean, I could go on about what inspired.
He's gone on. He's gone on.
No, we'll let Pith carry it, and then I'll say, David, do you recognize your own views in that terse description of David Frenchism?
You know, I feel the same way about that terse description of David Frenchism as I felt about the extended description of David Frenchism in First Things, which was, you torched a mighty nice straw man there, Sohrab. The fact of the matter is, and throughout my career, I have aggressively utilized the levers of American classical liberalism to not just maintain the presence of a Christian witness in the public square, to extend the physical presence of the Christian witness into some of the most hostile places in American higher education. I've done that relentlessly, and I've done that, I hope to, at the same time, even though as anyone who gets to know me in a short amount of time, and in the shortest amount of time knows I'm a fallen human being and I don't always live up to my ideals. I also try to do that in a way that's respectful of my opponents, recognizes their humanity, and also recognizes that often even some of their worst actions are motivated by good intentions. And so in that circumstance, I have gone into places far from this caricature that Sohrab painted of me having an airy above it all mentality. I've been absolutely on the ground in many of the most hostile places of the United States to a conservative, small O Orthodox Christian witness, and have not only maintained the Christian presence there, I have been a part of expanding the conservative cultural witness there, and even resourcing it in places that sought to deny it resources. And so what I thought was interesting about this first salvo is my experience of classical liberalism and the instruments of classical liberalism in American life is that they are the best antidote to the illiberalism of the left, that they provide a powerful weapon against the illiberalism of the left, and even more so than directly confronting and beating people in court, they also provide a powerful weapon of persuasion to sort of that great cloud of witnesses who are observing from afar, who don't know quite what to think, and they also want to know who can I actually like in all of this Sturm and Drang of the American culture war. And so my approach from the beginning has been to aggressively, offensively, but not offensively, offensively use the instruments of liberalism to expand the place of Christians in places that do not want Christians there. And so the idea that I am in any way, shape, or form an agent of retreat or surrender is completely false. It's a product of this weird Trump era that says that I'm an agent of surrender unless I get on board with him. No, I just have a new enemy in him also. And so that's Frenchism.
Before the rebuttal is rebutted, I think it's useful maybe to have a definition of terms for us to work with. What's your working definition of classical liberalism?
I would say it'd be essentially the values and principles modeled by the American founding and its major founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Declaration of Independence, all operationalized both in the main body of the Constitution, but also in the Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments.
Now it's your turn.
Well, here's what I mean by the retreat of a Christian vision of the good under the Frenchist model. And I'll try not to use that term too much. You'll remember.
Too late.
You'll remember, I noted in the piece just in a sort of elusive paragraph that all this was sparked by, I saw an ad for Drag Queen Story Hour in a library in San Francisco. I saw the ad on Facebook, and it just set me off. Now, whether or not, I think I have painted actually a fair description of you, but certainly in the response, you lived up to the description that I had painted, because you kind of poo-pooed. You remember, David, on a podcast, what Drag Queen Story Hour is. You said, quote, "That's the threat right there. I just don't get it." Now, that made it sound like Drag Queen Story Hour is a small phenomenon and a not very big of a threat. In fact, it's a global movement. It has 35 chapters in the U.S.
35 whole chapters.
Well, hold on. 35 chapters in the U.S. operating in 13 states and the District of Columbia. These events aren't small events like 20 parents. They often draw hundreds of parents and children. And it is a threat, and it is demonic, because by the description of the organizers themselves, it aims to, quote, promote a glamorous, unabashedly queer role model for kids. In Britain, you can find footage of a Drag Queen Story Hour reading hour in which the drag queen teaches children how to twerk. And he says, this is to an audience of kids, and you can hear like kids and babies kind of giggling. He says, you crouch down into this position, your bum sticking out, and you just move your bum up and down like that. And the parents laugh, and the kids kind of giggle unknowingly. So to me, that should raise a 5-alarm cultural fire. A sense that we have in a cultural crisis and a moral emergency. That blasé attitude, that's it, just a few chapters. That attitude rebuked David, earned a rebuke, David, from the closest thing you have to a supreme pontiff, Albert Mohler.
No, that is false. That is completely false.
But he did. Okay. Well, he did rebuke you. He's the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. He said, and he was addressing David on his radio show. He said, David, if that doesn't represent a cultural crisis to you, then I simply have to press the question even harder. Answer honestly. What then would it take for you to recognize a cultural crisis? And then pressed by a writer for Slate magazine, Mark Joseph Stern, who asked, well, what would you do about Drag Queen Story Hour, David? You said, well, I wouldn't do anything because it would encroach on, quote, local control over libraries. Oh, heaven forfend. So it's not a description just of, the difference is not just a matter of how to respond to the cultural crisis, it's whether or not, first of all, we recognize that a culture in which children, whether it's voluntary or not, people can do terrible things voluntarily, are brought into a space in which drag is performed. And drag can be, look, I live next to a drag bar, literally. Like, it's next to me on the same block in Manhattan. Does it bother me? Do I take armies of young Catholics with pitchforks? No, because it doesn't bother me there. But when it comes into interacting with children, with all its subtext of transvestic fetishism, yeah, I'm going to be concerned. Because I live in New York City, I live in the real world, not in a kind of idealized, thick Christian community. And in that setting, that poses to me, and I would say even to the parents who take their children for whatever reason, a kind of cultural crisis that needs to be taken seriously. And your responses to it, the kind of chuckling, oh, how many chapters and so forth, suggest that you don't recognize the crisis to begin with.
I do not recognize Drag Queen Story Hour as a cultural crisis of great import in the United States of America. We have a nation of 320 million people. It is a free nation. Throughout the course of our history, we have had cults here and there, polyamorous communities here and there, people who are doing bad things that I disagree with. It is a byproduct of a free nation. These are choices people make in a free nation. The other day I was driving to drop my youngest daughter off at a sleepaway camp in a little town called Crossville, Tennessee. It's a town in the middle of nowhere. It's between Nashville and Knoxville. It's heartland America. And across the street, kind of sort of close to the camp, is this odd-looking hotel. And I didn't know what it was, but I was intrigued because there hadn't been a hotel nearby. We might want to stay there when we were going to drop our kids off. And we were asking a family at the camp, and they said, oh, no, you don't want to do that. It's like, why? It's a swinger hotel in the middle of Crossville, Tennessee. Now, two things. One, I'm upset by that. There shouldn't be a swinger hotel in the middle of Crossville, Tennessee. The other thing is, this is a nation of 320 million people, many of whom we're all fallen. Majority, maybe, possibly, I don't know, only God knows, don't have a relationship with Jesus Christ. That's the crisis, okay? It manifests itself in different ways, Drag Queen Story Hour being one of the least significant. Here's a more significant. Tens of millions of Christian American men addicted to porn. That's infinitely worse than Drag Queen Story Hour. There are problems so far now. But then the question that I asked about Drag Queen Story Hour is, because this came up, what do we do about it? Because one of the things that you'll know and you'll understand if you have been dealing with the problems that Christians have been facing in public spaces in the United States of America is that we have fought long and hard to secure, beginning with a case called Widmar v. Vincent in the early 1980s, the right to viewpoint-neutral access to public facilities to propagate our particular message. It's one that thousands of Christian churches use now to provide access to public facilities. The spread of the gospel is facilitated in an immense way by viewpoint-neutral access to public facilities. This is an unquestionable, absolute fact, and it is one that we have fought for. Now, I don't like that 1,500 people in a year go to Drag Queen Story Hour, or 2,000 or whatever. It's less than the weekly attendance at my church in 1 week. I don't like that. I like to see every drag queen in the United States of America become to a saving relationship with Jesus Christ. I am not in any way willing to upset the constitutional order and to provide governments the ability to engage in viewpoint discrimination against disfavored organizations for the sake of dealing with that menace. You have to consider a larger superstructure, and the reality is that you cannot take these things on a case-by-case basis and establish rules that say free speech for me and not for thee. because then you better be sure that the me is always in charge. And in this country, the me will not always be in charge. The thee will be in charge sometimes. And if you have wrecked legal institutions, even on relatively smaller issues, because you hate this gathering so much, it's got to change, it's got to go, there's a price that's paid there. And there's a price that has ramifications far beyond any sort of benefit gained by not having these 35 chapters active in 35 public libraries in the U.S.
I think a typical Frenchian move is to say XYZ is already under assault, things are already terrible, and therefore we can't can't use the public power to at least
What
prevent.
public power would you use, and how would it be constitutional?
Well, certainly, I mean,
I would love for somebody to answer that question one time. What public power, how is it constitutional, and if it's not, do you believe it's worth changing the Constitution?
Well, I could see, for example, a hearing held on what's happening in our libraries, in which Senators Cruz, Hawley, and Cotton make the head of the Modern Library Association or whatever sweat, as they know they can. And what does that do? It sends a cultural message that we're up against this. We're going to fight this because it's obscene. I don't know. You can pass at the local level ordinances. You can organize.
Ordinances at the local level are subject to constitutional review.
And we'll fight it, and you'll fight it for us. But we're actually going to do it.
No. No. I will not fight for the limitation of the First Amendment.
Let me mention this so that because XYZ is already under assault, then we should expect or accept the next assault on sort of moral norms. So I want to quote to you.
But you still have not said
quote to you
what you would do about Drag Queen Story Hour besides hold a legislative
Well,
hearing.
hold on.
Go ahead, and then I'll...
In 2006, you wrote this about gay marriage, David. I know you've changed your mind, but at the time you wrote, quote, "Gay marriage changes nothing. Churches can still speak out on sexual immorality and can still choose not to perform gay marriages. And the gay couple down the street in no way threatens our straight marriages." And certainly for the couple in Oregon, it did pose a challenge to their marriage, David. So I know you've changed your mind.
I wrote at length about how I changed my mind about that.
I know
right?
you changed your mind. But my point is, if in 2006 you weren't woke to the threat that the 2006 version of the cutting-edge sexual revolutionary step will mean for us, then maybe you should sit this one out, because there are a lot of young people who are looking at what's happening.
Maybe I should. I'm never going to sit out the defense of the Constitution. Never. Okay, so the bottom line is, you are telling me you've still not said what legal doctrine you would change to deal with Drag Queen Story Hour. Say one thing.
Local ordinances
that are subject to constitutional review. So viewpoint neutrality in the allocation of resources of public buildings should go away.
and cultural pressure.
No, so you believe that viewpoint neutral access to, say, high school classrooms, to auditoriums by churches, to Bible study groups, gone.
No,
Okay.
that wouldn't be the case.
Well,
Yes, it would.
Well, let's try stepping back a tiny bit from drag queen story hours to pornography.
We can never step back from Drag Queen Story Hour. It will dog me.
No, but just, I mean, I think, I guess, I think David's question to you is fair, right? But ultimately, implicit in Ahmariism, if I may, is the idea that essentially social conservatism or traditional Christianity, whatever category you want to describe, requires, for its flourishing, a different interpretation of the Constitution than the one that has prevailed, at the very least since, I apologize for the echoes, at the very least since the school prayer decisions of the 40s and 50s. Do you think that's a fair, I mean, you're imagining local ordinances that would effectively viewpoint discriminate in ways that I think Supreme Court justices in 1877 might have supported and would not today. Is that fair?
Would lose 9-0 today.
We also have public decency laws that we actually very often, a lot of them are still on the books. They're just not aggressively prosecuted. In other words, the Bible study may not run afoul of public decency laws in a way that the Drag Queen Story Hour might. Obscenity laws, which again we used to have on the book and were only judicially defanged not that long ago, a generation ago.
Couple, how's,
I'll just go ahead and tell you, constitutionally, the typical drag queen story hour would not violate even old school obscenity laws that would be past constitutional.
When has that been tested? Drag queens interacting with
You
children?
feel free to test it, and you'll find that I don't surrender, and will fight against viewpoint discrimination in public accommodations, and you'll lose 9-0.
Okay,
But-
go to war for drag queens.
but
I'm
just
going to
no,
war
but,
for the First Amendment. See,
but
this is
just-
I want no. This is absolutely fundamental to this debate. It's absolutely fundamental. We live in a nation of enduring ethnic, religious, cultural differences, a continent-sized, multi-ethnic, multi-faith, multicultural constitutional republic. There is no circumstance under which any political movement in this country can create a superstructure where the people that you like always win and the people you don't like and you think are bad are always going to lose, and you're going to always like that outcome. And if you try to do it, you'll rip this place to pieces. The only way this place survives as a united country is if we apply 18th century solutions to this 21st century division, rediscover the First Amendment of the United States, rediscover religious freedom, rediscover commitments to due process, rediscover all of the instruments of change and all of the instruments of argument that we have used for generations to make this country a greater and more just nation. It does not mean it's ever going to be perfect. And we're always going to have people who do things in it that disagree. But you know what? I think one part of my Christian witness to this country and my Christian mission to this country is to live a value, a legal version of the golden rule. I'm going to fight for the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself. Because I also know that my rights are fragile. And that there's going to come a time when I'm going to need some assistance in fighting for the rights that I would most like to exercise. And so when you say I'm going to defend the First Amendment, it is Con Law 101. It is Constitutional Ethics 101, that sometimes that means that people you don't agree with and people you don't like are going to have to go to court and win.
I think one problem is that too much of the intellectual firepower of the right has been focused on lawyers and litigation. So, now, all those defensive battles, like I said in my piece, and I said just now, I applaud you, David, for fighting those. But often these things don't take place in a courtroom. What the sexual revolutionary left wants is not censorship. It wants self-censorship. It wants people who object to things like Drag Queen Story Hour, which, by the way, isn't akin to just a cult or a weird hotel. It's promoted by every kind of mainstream media power is behind it. So it's not quite that. And what they want is self-censorship and for people to just sort of take it. And that's what I would resist. And what I would say is that as much as it's valuable to fight things in the courtroom, there are cultural battles which can't be fought there, but must be fought there. Because as far as I'm concerned, look, Christianity cannot be just a religion for an elite elect where we create the most kind of degenerate society that throws every possible kind of obstacle in the way of a genuine kind of flourishing of religion, whether for Christians or others. You know, pornography, as you know, running into our homes through our screens. You know, my son, who's now 2.5 years old, statistically speaking, although I'll obviously do my best to avoid that, statistically speaking, he is likely to encounter hardcore pornography before he hits puberty. That's statistics. So the point is, we can't create an order in which all of that is facing the family, is facing true religion, and then say, oh, navigate this landmine and see if you're still among the elect at the end. Christianity is not just this private faith. It's also a peoplehood.
So
right?
hold on. All right. In the assault on David Frenchism, one of the core arguments you made against me was that I make too many cultural arguments.
No,
okay.
I'm saying...
And then you also said my calls for religious revival or renewal are little more than idle wishes that men would be moral.
Yep.
That's a call.
I stand with that.
I've spent much of my life not just arguing that we need to have a legal space, but then arguing that we have to have the courage to walk into that space and proudly, boldly, and with great grace and compassion and humility present the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's a both and. It is not, you don't win anything if you just win in court and then you're too timid to occupy that ground and to speak boldly. I made that very argument, and then all of a sudden I hear, no, that's too much to ask.
No, I'm not talking about your cultural arguments. I'm saying we need a state and a public order that supports the flourishing of religion, right? It means not just that we as Christians go out there and present our courageous witness, which we should, but Christianity, look, in the first century or so after Christ, Christianity was primarily an elite phenomenon and some ragtag bands of people that puzzled the Romans. It was only after the Constantinian conversion, right, that the average Roman cobbler could think of himself as becoming a Christian. Now, was he as dedicated as that first, second, third generation of Christians? Did he understand every aspect of the creeds and so forth? Not necessarily, but he still got some benefit from it, and the order that was created was decent.
So you used the language of culture a minute ago, but fundamentally, Ahmariism claims that there has been insufficient attention paid to the influence of state power on culture,
yeah,
right?
And I don't just, by the way, I don't just mean this LGBTQ stuff, which are the most hot button things, or pornography, but other dimensions of life as well. I mean, you've talked about this as well, Ross. Just the degree of insecurity that's built into American life, right? For you and I, David, we can have our castles. Right? You can pay for a $30,000 a year, whatever, classical Christian school. I can send my kid to a Catholic school, and I can do my best. Even if the Catholic school, if he comes home and says, Dad, which one of the 57 genders am I? I can take that up with the Archbishop. I can take it up with the Archdiocese. I can take it up to Rome all the way and protect my own kid. But for the average person who first of all, works 2 jobs, if they get sick, there's a chance they might be hit with a $10,000 cash bill, even if they have insurance and so forth. The whole order seems geared toward making it impossible for a kind of Christian peoplehood or religious peoplehood to flourish, except for elites who happen to live in thick religious communities and they can afford it, and gated communities and so forth. But I'm talking about my own real life in New York City. I mean, all these people live profoundly difficult lives. And whether they send their kids voluntarily to Drag Queen Story Hour or not, it is immaterial. It's not the real world. So,
I guess I'm going to press David in a minute, but I'm going to press you right now. It seems to at least some observers of this debate that having lost a succession of cultural battles, including arguably the battle over whether drag queen story hours are appropriate for children, that younger conservative Catholics and Christians generally, and I'm sure there are quite a few in this room here tonight who are sympathetic to your argument, have sort of come around to the idea that, well, we couldn't solve the smaller problem, so let's make the problem bigger, right? Because I think when David presses you on what specifically you want to do about, a specific objectionable cultural practice, the narrative, the argument is, there's a lot of space between have Josh Hawley hold a hearing and build a conservative Christian republic, right? And I think a lot of people reasonably ask, well, what is the interstitial activity, and how is it remotely more plausible than David's use of the existing liberal order to defend Christian practice, insufficient as in certain ways that might be?
Look, as a stopgap measure, we see a lot of Christians and others, middle-class people, working-class people, have at least found in the politics of populism a kind of protection against some of these forces,
Have they?
Yes.
Oh, explain that.
In the sense that, for example, we have...
They found some enthusiasm for a while, but concrete protection from these forces.
Yes, I mean, judicial appointments under this presidency. And this has been first of all, I mean, if you think about life as the most important value, it's the foundational value, really has been the most pro-life administration since Roe. And David, you're on the record saying we need to defeat Trump at the ballot box. You wrote that in a Time column a couple of times.
Oh, I've said that so many times.
Sure, but hold on. But that would mean plausibly a Senator Bernie Sanders, who today, or was it yesterday, suggested that one of the world's problems is that too many poor people are having children. And so, we should promote contraception and abortion and do away with the Mexico City rule. So look, as a baseline matter, when voters are standing up against this overweening, totalizing kind of liberalism that I'm talking about, you would have them settle for Bernie. What would Bernie's judicial appointments look like?
So I know a little bit about the judiciary, and one of the things that I know and I understand is that the advances that we have made in the First Amendment and religious liberty in this country, which have been pretty stunning. In the early 1980s, a lot of people don't realize this, it was an absolute open question as to whether or not a religious student group could use an empty classroom at a public university to hold a meeting. That was an open question. The question was, would that violate the Establishment Clause for a public university to provide an empty classroom? That was one. I can go down the line for 35 years in front of Republican appointees and Democratic appointees and chronicle the advance of individual liberty in the First Amendment over a 30-plus year span of time. A remarkable achievement in clearing the way almost all the time for our groups to speak that you would absolutely love, delivering messages that you would absolutely love, as opposed to some few that do not. And I have learned something in the course of a quarter of a century of litigation, and that is these battles are not won and lost in any one presidential cycle. They're not. I've been a pro-life, I started what I think was with the first dedicated pro-life club at Harvard Law School back in 1992. It's called the Society for Law, Life, and Religion. So students in here, whenever you form a club, please think of the acronym and how people say it, because for the next 25 years, I had founded SLUR at Harvard. So I've been a part of at the grassroots of the pro-life movement. I made a pledge shortly after I got back from Iraq when I was a senior counsel at the Alliance Defending Freedom that Students for Life for America, one of the most effective pro-life grassroots organizations in the United States, if any one of their students anywhere in the United States had a legal issue, we would represent them for free, and we kept that promise. So here's what I've seen about our cultural battles. If you win in the culture, any given election, it's not so indispensable. 1981, the abortion rate peaked in this country. 1981. It went down during pro-life President Reagan. It went down in pro-life President Bush. It went down in pro-abortion rights Bill Clinton. It went down in pro-life George W. Bush. And I disagree that Trump is the best pro-life president. Bush signed pro-life legislation Trump will never be able to sign. Obama, it went down during the Obama administration. In the last 5 years of the Obama administration, more pro-life laws were passed at the state level than were passed in any period of time in American history since Roe. The abortion rate right now is below the point it was when Roe was decided, when abortion was illegal in some parts of the United States of America. It is still a horrible tragedy. But the idea that we cannot make a massive public difference even when presidents go back and forth and change back and forth is completely false. And what we end up doing all the time is we catastrophize and magnify these presidential elections to the point where we will do what we have done with Donald Trump. All too many people, certainly I'm sure not anybody in this room, but defend conduct that you never would have defended before, wreck your public moral witness for people who are standing outside of the Christian faith. Because why? Well, the state of the Republic's at stake. Flight 93 election. I think it's more like this. The plane is going through turbulence. People charge the cockpit, choke out the pilot, get in the seat, and they're like, oh, that was just turbulence. Oh, crap. What do we do now? And what we've got is a situation where we are taking each one of these presidential elections, elevating them in importance to such a degree that it's justifying all kinds of garbage coming from the body of Christ. I mean, this very idea that civility and decency should be a second-order value, I want to hold you to that. That's not biblical. It's not biblical. The command to love our enemies, the command to treat people with kindness, these things are not tactics to abandon in the face of a Hillary Clinton presidency or when you need to own CNN on Twitter. These are fundamental moral obligations that have eternal resonance. And what we've done is we've taken this news cycle based in these cycles of presidential elections and said they're so vital, we're going to ditch so many of the other things we used to argue with full sincerity because it's an emergency. It's an
David,
emergency.
I live in New York City where more black babies are aborted than are born. That's an emergency. I aim to stop it. I won't listen to this kind of cheap moral.
How are you going to stop it?
Well, I think
for starters, for not helping elect one of these infanticidal
But
Democrats.
so let me pause on this point because I think there is a really important disagreement here, potentially, and I'll ask Sohrab if he thinks this
You
is
mean
fair.
we finally got to a disagreement?
I think we're doing pretty well. It's moderation is a delicate art. The story that you told, focusing on religious liberty jurisprudence and the abortion rate and pro-life legislation is an optimistic story. It's a story of pro-life gains, it's a story of Christian legal gains, and it's a story I've heard you tell eloquently before. I think it's fair to say that it's not the story that a lot of conservative Christians associate with the last 30 years. Not that they would deny that there have been real pro-life gains, not that they would deny that you've won courtroom victories, but there is a narrative that I think is grounded in some plausible social science data that the period in which you've won courtroom victories has been a period of decline in religious practice, decline in religious belief, decline in Christian influence over the culture, decline in Christian political power, a decline that has led in part to the ascent of a presidential candidate, now president, who you abhor, whose ascent wouldn't have been possible absent that decline. And I think a certain amount of Ahmariism, and I'll let you say if you think this is right or not, is rooted in a view basically that the gains that have been made are insufficient to the scale of the defeats that have been incurred. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And it's more than that. The demands for autonomy that we were worried about in the 1960s did exactly what the sort of worst or most pessimistic forecasters predicted they would, in the sense that it began with saying, recognize me as XYZ, so I can do XYZ, tolerate me, to not only will you recognize me and tolerate me doing XYZ, but you will celebrate it, and this will become the cultural norm. So that's, I think, what I mark as a kind of Ahmariist recognition of where the demand for autonomy and let me do what I want to do becomes, you will like it, and you will in your soul, in your heart of heart, you will celebrate me in this new, fully autonomous, norm-defining self.
Can I ask then, it seems to me that when you on sort of the agenda that lies between local ordinances and a different society, that you came around to populism and support for Donald Trump. But isn't Trump, at least as we've observed to date, just a different version of what you're critiquing from David, right? If you're saying, well, David is just trying to use, these levers of a religiously neutral society to protect Christian witness, isn't populism using the levers of a not particularly Christian populism to protect Christian witness? I mean, to what extent do you buy David's argument that electing Donald Trump and making him a standard bearer for a re-Christianization of society has potentially dramatic costs for Christian witness?
I don't entirely deny the costs. I mean, I've believe me, I've written my share of articles dinging Donald Trump for X, Y, Z outrageous things that he's said. But what I would say is that we Christians are not of the world, but we are in the world. And so that means that we have to make concrete political choices at any given moment. We're not all called to be, as I said, St. Stephen's or St. Agnes's. A lot of us are just normal people who want to see a kind of Christian flourishing and a religiously traditional flourishing to go beyond Christians. And so we should try to forestall the Colosseum. Just because the Colosseum isn't here, we shouldn't say, oh, thank goodness, at least I'm not being fed to the lions. I should try to avoid the Colosseum stage from getting here. And so,
But that's not the same as bringing Constantine to power, right? I mean, David is trying to avoid the Colosseum too, right?
Well, no, I think in a certain kind of what about our Christian witness all the time, behind it, the unspoken assumption is we should take it because that's the path of martyrdom. Now, there are people who are called to that, and they'll face it when it happens, and they should. And there are also religious people here, and I mean Catholic religious and priests and so forth, who are called to this kind of heroic life. But we shouldn't want that for all Christians. While we have political agency, we should try to forestall the Colosseum, and that means, not Bernie Sanders, not in any way making peace with.
Do you think that Bernie Sanders would bring the Colosseum? I mean,
well, I think
of course he wouldn't.
I think we're
He doesn't even have a plan to deal with Mitch McConnell.
I think that's a funny line, but I think
He doesn't.
When senators, mainstream Democratic senators, speak of the Knights of Columbus as an extremist organization akin to the KKK and so forth. Look, literal Colosseum, no. But not all of the Knights of Columbus, as is honorable organization, is called to live a life of martyrdom. They should be allowed to do their charitable work. And so that tells you something about the mindset of the kind of secular liberalism that we're facing. It frames the Knights of Columbus as an extremist organization. So when I say civility is a secondary norm, I do want to press this point, because in the article, I said we should use civility to promote our order, but civility itself assumes that there is a moral consensus. It assumes that we agree about the most basic things, like drag queens shouldn't interact with children, or the Knights of Columbus objectively pursue the good and are not an extremist organization. Or in the case of Bernie Sanders, we shouldn't try to kill off the children of the third world poor before they're born. So in that case, for me to abide in a civil way with that worldview, that is also profoundly unchristian, and I'm not called to be civil in response to that.
So what do you mean by not being civil? What do you mean by not being civil? Because when I see everyone who is applauding that on Twitter, okay, don't be civil, don't be civil. Yeah, oh man. It's like, what did you do in the great cultural conflict of 2018? I was an asshole on Twitter. I don't even know what this means to not, I don't even understand what you're saying. So to not be civil in response to the drag queens, well, okay, so we're to love our enemies. We're to bless those who persecute you. Bless them, love them. Now that
love them, but
that's not indulging them in sin.
Or you should also recognize them as enemies, even as you love them.
So wait a minute. Where in no context have I said that these people are my ideological friends? But I'm not going to recognize them as enemies in the way that you described them, as war and enmity. You talked about war and enmity.
I think you're conflating military service and war in that
Words
sense
have meaning.
with cultural war.
Words have meaning. War and enmity.
The
fact of the matter is, enmity is not love. Is enmity love? No, it is not love.
Can correction be love?
Correction is, well, to ask my dad. Yeah.
Right. So legal correct. So the power of the state can be employed for moral correction out of love.
Oh, absolutely. Justice is an act of love. Justice is building a just society, providing due process to the accused, providing You know, when I said earlier about the Bill of Rights and the Civil War amendments, in many ways, these documents are a manifestation of what it looks like when a nation's leaders have enough foresight to love their citizens and to love the citizens that will come after the present generation. And these documents and the ideas behind them are worth fighting for and worth preserving, because what they end up doing is operationalizing as much as any human system that we have ever devised, especially one as divided and diverse as the United States of America. We have operationalized in a really profound way love for our fellow man by granting them the rights of, even if people are bitter ideological opponents, the same rights that we'd like to exercise ourselves. And that is, and to the extent that you can love your enemies in a legal way, that is one way to do it. And I think it's a very powerful Christian witness when you do it as a Christian to defend the liberty of people who even disagree with you.
Those documents and those amendments assume a kind of religious horizon. Their fundament is a view of man that is explicitly religious. From the founders to Lincoln, you constantly hear talk of not God, of the highest good, though they may not put it in that particular set of terms. And so if that is directly attacked by the other side, which has become an explicitly secularist party, the Democrats are no longer bound to that vision, then you don't have a social consensus. And let's talk about the good. Let we conservatives put forward a vision of the good that includes, what the best of the founding included in it, which is that ultimately we're subject to God, and the best things come from God, and ultimately we owe Him a debt of gratitude, including by creating a sufficiently moral order. I don't think the founders and the people who wrote those documents would look at the fact that hardcore pornography is a click away from my son, or the fact that children interact with drag queens and it's celebrated, or child drag queens themselves, like Afghan dancing boys, are celebrated on mainstream media. I don't think they look at those and say, look, the procedural norms we set in place have worked out really well.
Well, at no point have we had a nation where everything's been great and awesome. The founding generation, which created documents that were among, as I've just sung an ode to them, looked at a situation where they had, at that point, 4 million people living on their soil who should have been citizens of that country, who were held in involuntary, brutal servitude. And one of the great values of the founding was that these documents were in moral tension, irreconcilable moral tension with many of the realities of the day. And I think that one of the things that we have to be able to do, and because again, we're having this argument, and I keep talking about, here are these concrete, actual laws that exist that protect your rights of expression. Here are concrete ways in which you can engage in your acts of engage in expression. Here is a call for moral renewal and revival, which I think, if American history, one of the things that American history teaches us is we should never scorn the possibility of religious revival. I mean, why would we do that? Anytime, ever. We have had great awakenings in this country. And the idea that we're going to scorn the concept of religious revival, as you did in your piece against me, I was flabbergasted by that. I thought we would be in agreement about something like that.
I didn't revile it. I said it's not enough.
You said it's an idle wish that men be moral. That's your words.
Well, how about this question though? So, I mean, in the run up to the Civil War, right, there was a vigorous debate about whether the Constitution permitted the government of the United States to pursue the concrete moral good of abolition, right? And there were ways in which figures who were sort of not, sort of in between the sides of that era, like Stephen Douglas, made essentially proceduralist arguments, and basically said you'll tear the republic apart if if the abolitionist cause pushes itself all the way. So obviously, David, you think, Lincoln was right and Douglas was wrong, and you think something similar about abortion today, right? You wouldn't say that that sort of purely procedural norms, a purely procedural conception of human liberty can can prevail over the basic right to life. But what about, we brought up pornography, what about pornography and school prayer together? Because it seems to me that there is this dividing line in American constitutional history somewhere in the 40s through the 60s, where you pass from a dispensation in which what you're calling classical liberalism was assumed to allow for not an established church, but a kind of legal preference for public expressions of Christianity, and a legal preference for or allowance for morals legislation around porn, in particular obscenity, that reflected Christian principles. And if you ask people today, where does classical liberalism stand on porn and school prayer, they would say, oh, classical liberals are against school prayer and against restrictions on porn, most classical liberals. What's your view of those two issues?
Well, I don't think that porn, for example, would fit within the original intent or original public meaning of the First Amendment. I think that if you went to the founders and you said, does the freedom of speech that is protected by the First Amendment include pornography, they would look at you as if you'd grown horns out of your head. Like, what are you even talking about? The issue with pornography, unfortunately, is far beyond a constitutional issue. The issue with pornography, unfortunately, is the point where the cultural craving for that product is so strong that even though municipalities and localities have, in theory, often a lot of ability to regulate it, and for example, Times Square, and have in some ways, Times Square, for example, some of you guys are old enough to remember going to Times Square. Holy smokes, that place was horrific. Now it's Disneyland, New York City, practically.
Because everyone's looking at it on their smartphone.
And so there was an ability to regulate it there. The problem that you have is not, is there a legal ability to regulate porn? The problem that you have is a deep sickness of the soul that is afflicting millions upon millions of people, to the point where if you talk to public officials, because one of the things in my long life of not fighting that I fought over was porn. And so back in my days with the Alliance Defending Freedom and going back to the Reagan Commission on Porn, one of the things that we sort of, we legal activists in the religious conservative movement were trying to do is get in legislators' ears. There's more you can do about porn. There's more you can do about porn. There's more you can do about porn. Leave me alone. Leave me alone. No. And that was a terrible realization. It was a terrible realization. And so, what I realize is we have to go back to first principles and be in our churches, in our families, talking to our sons, talking to our family members, and we've got an enormous amount of cultural repair that we have to do, because right now the political appetite, I don't think Trump's going to be your guy on this, by the way. The political appetite here is non-existent, and that is it's a cultural tragedy, and one that was a shocking realization for me many years ago, and one that, I think one of the most powerful things, Ross, that I think you've written many powerful things, but one of the most powerful things you've written was, your eulogy, if you have heard. And the awful damage that was done. Look, guys, I see damage all around me. I see damage. I just moved from a community that had an issue with opioid overdoses. Meth had been left behind. It's begun kind of coming back a little bit economically now. I went to a public high school in a very small town in Kentucky where an enormous amount of my classmates just dropped out. I've been a part of homeless ministries to at-risk youth for much of my life. There is damage out there. There's enormous damage. What I have a problem with is the idea that if what we need to do is get the right sort of technocrats in charge who will then fix the liberal order by stripping liberties here and stripping liberties there, and that we're going to fix this sickness. I just reject that.
But you would strip those liberties.
I don't think there is a First Amendment right. I don't think that pornography, as commonly exists, is a protected category of speech under the First Amendment.
Because we asked 7 o'clock, I want to turn to questions, but I want to bring, I'm trying to end my dubious moderation with some agreement here, right? Because that's Ahmariism, in a sense.
No,
Your willingness...
That's originalism.
Right, but your argument there is that the originalist interpretation of the Constitution allows for essentially morals legislation that reflects a Christian worldview about pornography, right? I'm looking.
Sure.
I'm looking for common ground, and then, but then I just want to press you on school prayer because I feel like I pressed Sohrab a bit earlier. What's your current view of the school prayer jurisprudence? Because there too, the founders.
The school prayer cases are garbage constitutional jurisprudence. I mean, they are. There's no real. There's no.
But you're an Ahmarist. You think. I'm just looking. I'm looking for Christian fellowship before I turn it over.
Look.
Right? We are all Frenchists. We're all Ahmarists at some level.
This is the Christian fellowship gesture right here. Now, don't tell my Church of Christ friends that I grew up with. Please don't watch this live stream. But
I'm saying you allow for a much larger zone for potentially state power to regulate public morality and promote Christianity than is allowed under the current classical liberal reading of the Constitution. That's all I'm suggesting. Do you think that's fair?
In certain areas, I would say yes. I would also, the one thing though, getting to the substance of the school prayer issue, one of the problems, so the school prayer jurisprudence that says you can't have a prayer to start a school day, you can't have a prayer at a school graduation that's led by in a secondary school graduation that's led by a school official. It has to be student-led. I just think that's bad constitutional jurisprudence. But I will say this. I will say that some of the worst days for American liberty, and as experienced, unfortunately, disproportionately by the Catholic community, are when our state and local governments begin to seize upon themselves the notion that essentially, for example, the public schools are the Protestant schools, parochial schools are religious schools, and the Blaine Amendments began to pass across the United States of America. We have ample experience in this country of when we say, because again, let's go back to the reality, this is a multi-faith country and it's a multi-Christian denomination country. We have ample unfortunate experience that when Christianity and Christian principles start to become codified in a sectarian manner, there are a lot of Christian losers in that process. And so I am extremely hesitant. I'm extremely hesitant to say that government should push the Constitution to the red line push their public acts to the red line constitutionally, because I think we are extremely divided on these grounds. I've lived in enough communities in the very Christian South to know that the first thing that would come up when it would say, we need to be more Christian, is that it's then, okay, which denomination? I grew up in a denomination.
That's when we send in the Knights of Columbus,
Yeah,
though.
right.
So,
I grew up in
Sohrab, I just want to let Sohrab say, and then we'll do Q&A.
I think that I want to, again, sharpen the divisions here, as is my wont. I'm glad we agree on porn. I think a lot of our encounters with life as a whole are now mediated by social media, and I think here's an example where you can see a clear division. When Senator Hawley proposed, some technocratic, if you will, fixes to the fact that screens are incredibly addictive, and we know that social media companies actually hire neurologists to make the use of social media as addictive as possible, you called him, what was it, the daddy
The Republican
statist?
daddy state. Yeah,
Well, I disagree. I think I'm a smoker, but I'm glad we regulate tobacco because it's addictive. I'm glad we regulate alcohol in various ways. Frankly, some of you know, I'm willing to ban things. Let me put it that way. But my point is this: that in each of these cases, I think you see the difference between the various kinds of conservatism. I think a new generation of conservatives is asking of every situation, not necessarily what will this do? Will this hinder or promote individual autonomy of firms or individual actors, but whether it serves a good, which we, until not too long ago, Christians, including Protestants, could agree on some things as being good and some things as being bad, and it wasn't all left to the impersonal forces of market and so forth. So when that proposal was put forward by Senator Hawley, it's not as if I agreed with every provision, like having videos pause after 30 seconds or whatever it was, but at least he's willing to say, here's a problem, and the state may have a role because, as I said, not every parent is the way you and I and Ross is. A lot of parents don't have the power to, they don't have the time, they don't have the resources to regulate these things. They could use a little state help.
So,
Quickly.
yeah, okay. So,
My kids have been making.
first, I don't
video.
necessarily think it's a scandal when companies hire experts to try to make their products more palatable to the consuming public. I mean, we have armies of people who are trying to make sugary drinks taste better, who are trying to make cars look more attractive. Maybe I don't even want or need a car right now, but hey, that new Honda Accord looks really nice. This is part of, I like Honda Accords.
Honda Accord, man?
That's what I have.
That is such a French
David Frenchism.
I have. Sue me. I have a Honda Accord. I like it. Okay. Before that, I had a Toyota Tundra, which every writer needs to have to haul all those words.
Maybe we can pivot to questions and answers.
Let's open it up.
Okay, remember the format, right? So yeah, I see hands are going to go up. We're going to have a couple of grad students who will circulate with the microphones. I feel like the microphones are a little bit like Goldilocks and the porridge, right? We had too cold, too hot, and just right. I want to be clear. It wasn't planned that David would have the microphone that actually seems to work. Vinny is going to take it around on one side, Matthew on the other. I will identify people. I'm going to start over here on the far right, Matthew. Hand up. Yeah. And then, Vinny, you can go over here up front next. Okay, so we'll start over here on the far right.
It doesn't work. So I just wanted to answer Mr. French's rhetorical question. Do you think Bernie Sanders is the Colosseum? I think socialism is the Colosseum. I just want to be clear about that, rounding up Christians. I had a criticism of Mr. Mahari, but I wanted to ask this question. It seems to be presented right now, tonight, and I came late, that it's a either-or presentation of how to address the culture, and I think it's both and. I feel like I'm listening to two coaches say, it's offense, and it's like, no, it's defense. And I think you need as much of a good quarterback or a good pitcher as you need a good defensive linesman or a good midfielder or outfielder, that is. So I'd like you to speak to that, because I couldn't imagine two politicians from, say, the 1500s or the 1800s saying, no, we have to all do it this way, or we have to all do it this way. So I'd just like you to speak to that, the goodness of the array of arguments that the other side articulated.
So I am a both and kind of thinker on this. So I think a lot of, I would say, liberal or libertarian conservatism the past generation or so has been articulated as we need to build up defensive barriers so that, if they come to power, they can't crush us. And so I support that. I think that's the kind of work that David has done in the courtroom. But a movement can't win on a defensive posture alone. It can't just be we stand for, we'll do our best to create a kind of a cultural situation in which, at least in the private sphere, or at least in limited ways in the public sphere, we can exercise religion. I think a movement has to stand for a substantive vision of the good. What is good for families? What is good for communities? And I think too often, and to recognize that in some cases, not in every case, I don't want the state to regulate everything. I think in many instances, individual action in the market can best serve the common good. But we recognize that there is a common good. And there are common goods that are proper to the family, to the church, and the state has a role in nourishing that in a community that is not in cultural crisis. And so that's what I'm saying, is the Frenchism defense posture terrific, but also go on the offense, including at the level of the state. Because the need for a religious horizon doesn't end in a private sphere, in one's own encounter with Scripture. People have a religious horizon also in their collective experience, in the state. That's all I'm saying. And so if you have that, you'll see a different kind of conservatism emerge, and I would say that in very inchoate, imperfect ways, the conservative nationalist or populist nationalist movements, both here and on the other side of the Atlantic, are testing out a politics of this kind. And I'm just not prepared to say, oh, no, don't do that, classical liberal principles, because where we are is cultural crisis. I think it's a five-alarm fire.
So where you are is you have already said that you would undermine viewpoint neutrality in First Amendment jurisprudence.
Yeah, I would.
That's a disaster, y'all. That's a disaster. That's not offensive. That's stupid. It is.
We went back
Look, there are thousands of churches and religious organizations that depend on that viewpoint neutrality for their existence and for their flourishing. They are thousands, okay? So much of even the civil rights movement. I remember talking to the Reverend Walter Fauntroy years and years ago, one of the founders of the Congressional Black Caucus, somebody instrumental in the early parts of the civil rights movement with Dr. King, and I asked him, given that we still have massive problems with racism in this country, we have massive legacies left over from slavery and Jim Crow, we did have a period of time of extraordinary legal change in this country where 350 years of de jure discrimination were ended. And I asked him, how did this happen? And one of the things he said was, it was two factors, Almighty God and the First Amendment. That the First Amendment gave me the ability to speak, and Almighty God softened men's hearts to our message. And those words have stuck with me. That you go to Frederick Douglass and read his speech in Boston in 1860 about how the incredible importance of this right of free speech is to the ending of oppression. It's the thing that makes tyrants tremble. And to sit here and to say we're going to get rid of a bedrock, the viewpoint neutrality is one of the bedrocks.
Can I just pose the question though again then, because the civil rights movement did rely on the First Amendment, did rely on Almighty God, but it also had specific political and legal goals that were meant to help change men's hearts by changing their behavior. Is there anything in the world of, call it populism, call it whatever you want to call it, is there anything that religious conservatives have not been proposing as a legal change or a political goal over the last 20 years that you think they should be proposing?
Over the last 20 years.
Or any time, recently, is there anything, when Sohrab says there have to be ways to use the power of the state to make it easier to be a religious believer, is there any place where you would say, yes, there's some form of state power that we
Yeah, absolutely. So there have been a series of state laws that have passed that have buttressed free speech on college campuses, for example, that have explicitly protected the right of Christian organizations to form and organize on campus, because one of the worst Supreme Court precedents about the last 20 years was a case called Christian Legal CLS v. Martinez. I blocked it out of my mind because it's so awful. That gave universities a pathway, if they do A, B, C, and D, to wholesale kick religious groups off campus. And so multiple states in the last 5 years have been passing laws that are specifically designed to protect religious freedom. Many states are passing laws that are specifically designed to protect rights of conscience, that where we're not waiting on the courts to sort of figure out this masterpiece cake shop kind of case, and you're affirmatively protecting rights of conscience. These are very creative laws that have been, and vital laws being passed in states all across the nation. We've seen more laws of that type passed in like the last 2 to 3 years than we've seen in any given time in American history.
Very quick. Again, David, a lot of our experience doesn't happen at the courtroom. It's often, by the way, it happens in private settings where, because of the power of woke capital, before people even begin to say what they want to say, they'll self-censor. Right?
So I just was describing legislation, not the court.
I understand.
Okay.
Let's go on.
Yep.
Hi, this is reacting to David French and asking a question to both. You spilled a lot of words talking about due process, and I'm a lawyer and I understood everything you said. but you didn't finish the story. You talked about,
story?
I'm going to tell you. You talked about holding up this due process idea as really a very important thing to protect. But who processes the due process? They are the judges on the courts. When you have lawless judges on the courts, nobody has due process. Who puts the judges on federal courts? The executive. It is unbelievably important who is in the White House so that they're appointing people on the courts so that due process, which is absolutely important, is attended to. Real quick. The federal judiciary has been a disaster for abortion jurisprudence for the last 30 years, an absolute disaster. The gains that have been made in pro-life and bringing the numbers down, they're all because of state laws. Dr. Michael New can tell you that. We've been tremendously defensive. Getting a president in who will put people on the bench that will actually uphold pro-life laws is tremendously important.
So here, let me, not long ago, I gave a speech where I said some of my typical words about my feelings about the current president. And a very angry speaker came up to me afterwards, very angry, and brought up the judge's issue was the issue. The judge's issue was the issue. And I said, so after Jimmy Carter was a disaster for the Democrats, how many judges did the Republicans nominate over the next 12 years? The answer is 570 judges were nominated after a disastrous presidency that discredited the Democratic Party until the Berlin Wall fell in the White House. 570. The judiciary is shaped over a long period of time, not in 4-year increments, and over a long period of time. And so one of my core problems with Donald Trump is that this man is such a moral disaster, such a ball of incompetence, that he stands to, what he does is he risks the credibility of the party that could be nominating judges for the next 20 years. Now, the other thing I would say about due process, one of the greatest atrocities of due process in the last quarter century, maybe since the beginning of the modern civil rights era, is the Obama administration Title IX guidance on college campuses that essentially swept away core due process protections as a condition for receiving federal funding. Colleges then went beyond that and began to strip due process systematically from students. Now, this is something that a lot of people say about that we should just give up on persuasion. It's all brute force. That is being defeated across the United States, not just by Trump appointees and Bush appointees and the few remaining Reagan appointees, but by Clinton appointees and by Obama appointees, and some of the individuals who've been bringing the most powerful and effective arguments against this assault on due process are a collection of Harvard law professors that I used to think hated my guts when I was there as the token Christian conservative, who, when push came to shove, unlike this always us versus them mentality that we have, actually said, you know what, I'm going to stand up for the liberal order here, and I'm going to defend this core American constitutional right. And so right now, more than 100 universities have faced adverse decisions. It's one of the more striking counterattacks, and it's happened on a bipartisan basis against a negative cultural legal development that I've seen in a very long time. So we cannot just simply say, and as a lawyer who did this for a very long time, I never walked into a courtroom and I said, who's the appointee? Who appointed them? And then decided that I knew how this was going to come out. Never did I do that. I made an effort to persuade, and quite often it succeeded in persuading even people that you would say would have been my ideological opponents. So I just reject the notion that everything stands or falls on any given 4 years of judicial appointments.
Yeah, I guess I want the judges who are fair-minded on campus due process, but also are pro-life, and more of them. And we're getting tons of them under this administration. And I will have to remind the Kavanaugh episode. He's a very valuable appointee, but that came at a huge cost. Now you say
He's not nearly as valuable as Amy Coney Barrett would have been.
I agree. But he was appointed at the point of his life being destroyed, or nearly destroyed. So again, when you say there's no enmity, the Kavanaugh affair was a profound display of enmity.
I'm not saying they're not showing enmity
And
towards
by the way,
us.
I don't think.
Of course they are.
I think it was dare I say, a kind of Trumpian move to stick by him. I don't think
But wasn't it
George
too
H.W. Bush stood by Clarence Thomas.
Hold on. No, I would say it was a profoundly Trumpian move and a McConnell move to stick by him. I'm not sure a President Jeb would have taken the heat of Washington Post op-eds. I don't.
His dad stood by Clarence Thomas.
I don't think a President French would have done that.
Oh, that's total bull crap. That is total. Hey, I tell you what. You talk to me about courage when you walked with your boots on Iraqi sand in the middle of the surge. How dare you? How dare you?
I mean, I hate to say this.
Let Sohrab best answer.
You were a JAG, right? Were you a?
I was certainly not like.
I think we have to run this for one more minute.
I was certainly.
You asked me to moderate. Here I am.
I was certainly not like the armor officers that I served with who are outside the wire every day. I served with heroes. I served with people who did things that I can't even imagine. Some of those guys who are closer to me than brothers were killed, horribly wounded. I did my best to help them. I was outside the wire with them regularly. I'm incredibly proud of my service, but I know where it fits in the scheme of the surge and who did what. And I'm not SEAL Team 6, but I am somebody who, when I was 37 years old, was morally convicted that I could not continue to support a war that I wasn't willing to fight in myself. And I went to my wife and my 2 children, and I said, I feel like I have to join the military. She thought I was insane at first. Maybe I was. I went to Fort Lee, Officer Basic. Michael Bay is not doing any training montages of my time in the military. But I did my best. And I will tell you what, it is quite a moment in your life to say to anybody, you know what, I don't have to get in this Humvee, I don't have to go on this mission across uncleared roads, but I'm going to do it because it's the right thing, and because if I'm going to present any kind of leadership in my role as just a JAG, I'm going to have to demonstrate some personal courage. And he denigrated my military service. And that's a gut check time. It's not SEAL Team 6. I didn't take down bin Laden. We had guys who didn't just take down one, who were so proficient in hand-to-hand combat they could take down 2 Al-Qaeda fighters at the same time. I mean, that's not me. I mean, my gosh, they would have taken me down quickly. But I did my best. And here's the thing that is disgusting about what you did to me. What's disgusting about what you did to me is you opened me up to attacks on alleging that.
Come on, David. We
cowardice.
all have Twitter trolls. Come on. I write stuff and I get attacked.
So, are you
All right,
saying?
we're gonna-
Whoa,
we're
whoa,
gonna-
whoa!
no, I think now I let that exchange run. Should we do one last question?
Yeah,
And then-
we have one more question over here, and then I think we'll end there. Thank
Yep.
you.
Okay. Last month, the state of Illinois joined California, New Jersey, and Colorado in passing a law that schools must teach the significance of the contributions of LGBT historical figures and affiliated events. Now, 4.5% of the country are LGBT, somewhere around 70% of the country are Christian. Presumably, they can do that because the LGBT agenda is a cultural movement and a political ideology, not a religion. Now, Christians are fighting against an opposition that's fundamentally irreligious, but within a liberal political order that's constituted to balance competing religious views. In that context, is fighting for a co-equal Christian space in the public sphere not at an overwhelming disadvantage?
Sohrab, then David.
No, I think this is a good one for David.
All right, David.
Fighting for a co-equal space a disadvantage for us? I believe the words of the Christian faith are empowered by the Holy Spirit of the living God, and that I don't even need a co-equal space. I just need a space. And I think those words cut to the heart of man. I think those words transform lives. I think those words transform nations. So co-equal space, from where I stand, is a great place to be. The Christian faith spread like wildfire from not even a position of a co-equal faith and co-equal space. So I don't fear engagement with the left as long as I can speak and I can say words. I say words that hopefully, by God's grace, have eternal truth behind them. And so I don't fear. Co-equal to me is fantastic. I don't need better than that. I don't even need co-equal.
Again, I think, just to address your point, I think that's ahistorical to say that the transformation of the Roman Empire did not play a huge role in helping Christianity become a religion that preached to the multitudes. And it created that created an environment in which it flourished as a mass religion. And I think the example of that curricular material and many others.
Did I say? I said it spread like wildfire. It spread like wildfire, which it did. It did not. I did not say. I did not say what you're asserting that I said about its position in the Roman Empire.
Do you think, last question for both of you, that there is a Protestant Catholic difference here?
Oh.
No. Last question, then round. That there is America's, in terms of the view of the importance of institutional forms and church-state relations in shaping Christianity. Do you think that's
I don't think. I don't think so. I mean, in my, from this Protestant standpoint, it seems to me like some of the chief offenders against the liberal order that have inflicted that pain on another religious faith, it's been the dominant Protestant establishment inflicted a lot of pain on the Catholic Church, and the Catholic Church needed to appeal to the principles of liberalism to get some relief from that and continue as the legal assault on Blaine amendments demonstrates that there's still some more work to be done in that area. So I don't think there's anything at all inherent to any particular theological strain of Protestantism except those strains of Protestantism that are completely disengaged. I came from a religious tradition that for a long time was just completely disengaged from politics. But if you're talking about mainstream, small o, Orthodox Protestantism, I don't think there is anything I don't think there is a religious divide on these issues.
I think there is. I think that historic Christianity has never just been a private encounter with Scripture alone. It's been a collective experience. It's been bound up with people's daily lives in a way that I think shapes how Catholics, even in this country, approach these issues. And so, but that doesn't mean that we can't work together. That doesn't mean that we can't fight some of the common causes that we have fought together side by side. But I think we have to create or restore the fundament that makes a flourishing Christian life possible. And sometimes a very minimal view of the role of the state, which is a kind of Protestant vision, sometimes stands in the way of that.
All right, I'm going to leave things there. I want you all to join me in thanking our